Wound is a place where light enters you. Wound is a place where light enters you. Hello, my name is Dr. Tayyib Rashid. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I'll unpack this quote from great Sufi poet Rumi by sharing a few ideas which can foster healing and flourishing. I'll share these ideas in the context of 3 hypothetical vignettes of males from diverse cultural backgrounds who experienced childhood sexual abuse. Although hypothetical, these vignettes share many characteristics of real life experiences. So let's start with the first one. Imagine Ahmed, a young adult Muslim male, sexually abused as a child by a religious teacher in a mosque in a distant land. Soon after the abuse, family immigrated. Ahmed negotiated transitional challenges well and excelled academically. He came from a religious family and kept meticulous hygiene routine. Yet he always felt as if his body was not clean, which made him anxious. As age increased and body changed, his self-loathing also deepened. So did his anxiety. He could not even fathom the thought of disclosing to anyone about how awful he felt about his body, because he was so worried about saving the face of family. Now, think about Lee, who experienced repeated sexual abuse as a young boy, perpetrated by a white male who was a close family friend. The abuse continued intermittently for many years. Lee felt something was wrong, but he was so scared to disclose because he thought no one would believe him against this much admired white male. And he also feared if he told his parents, they will think, quote unquote, he might be homosexual. Lee liked a girl in high school and finally mustered up courage to ask her out. She said no flatly. And later on, through grapevine, Lee found out that she said he was not his type and he was a bit effeminate. That comment hurt Lee. So he started chasing a white male ideal. From a shy, nerdy, acquiescent, introvert boy, he wanted to become an ambitious, competitive, funny, independent, and of course, muscular male. He worked hard for it, and he attained most of it. He started dating and completed school and went to college, finished college, and attained a good job. He noticed whenever his boss or supervisor was a white male, he immediately assumed a submissive or compliant posture. Now consider the third one, Antonio, a young adult from an ethnic background, raised by a single mother. The coach he revered as a father figure sexually abused him in high school. As he grew up, he felt ashamed and angry for not being able to defend himself, despite having the physical power because he was stronger than his coach. With his trust breached, he felt betrayed, wounded, and stopped trusting anyone. He never approved of any guy his mom dated. As he grew up and entered into a relationship, he found one thing, that he could not trust his partners. Small disagreements and doubts turned into shouting matches. Repeated relationship failures convinced him he cannot become a good partner or a good father. In all these three vignettes, what is the common thread? Shame. And with shame comes the fear of disclosure. Shame is a complex concept, and cultural layer compound this complexity. Shame is also a painful experience. Folks, when we are in pain, what do? We seek social support, we go to our loved ones. But the shame that comes from abuse, like in cases of Ahmed, Lee and Antonio, actually keeps them not to share, not to seek social support. So very early in the treatment, I try my best to empathically attune myself to the narrative of shame of survivors. I try my best to zero in to the specific aspect the survivor is ashamed about, and work together with them to find the light of strengths which could pass through the wound of shame. Once we are able to establish that trust, so that gradually survivor is able to share the shame, the next important consideration is to have them believe that change is possible, but change is always a process, because survivors suffer in silence, believing that nothing can be changed. Indeed, we cannot change what happened in the past. Nonetheless, we can change how they can relate with the past, establishing a different, less shameful, less painful relationship with the past is paramount towards healing and flourishing. But keep in mind, the process of change is uncomfortable. Now, if change is possible and it is a process, what are some factors that we should keep in mind? The first one that comes to my mind is cultural competence. It is good to see sensitivity to cultural context, but cultural context does not necessarily translate into cultural competence. Cultural competence is deep learned skills through experience of working through lines of difference. For example, when you're working with a client like Ahmed, the relational aspect would be very important. The relation to the family, relation to the community, relation to religion, and how the idiom of distress in the collectivist Islamic culture is both the facilitative or a barrier to healing. And let's not forget that not all individuals belonging to same culture subscribe or want to subscribe to that culture. There are always idiosyncratic differences that individual from one culture don't want to be like others for many reasons. Next, avoid simple solutions. avoid overly simplistic notions and ideas of healing, telling Ahmed that he can wash all his wounds by prayer, or Lee can recover his tattered self-concept by some sort of a makeover, the which he tried, or releasing the bottled anger will fix Antonio's all relationship problems. These may be overly simplistic solution. Such ideas overlook the layered complexities of experiences of abuse, so please avoid them. Talking distills thinking. We are doing more and more tasks of life and living in virtual space, and this phenomena is likely to increase. Nonetheless, I do believe there is no synthetic alternative to face-to-face talking, although I'm doing this pre-recorded talk, because we are wired to deal with deeply held pain not alone. We do this so through honest and trusted conversation in which we become vulnerable in front of a therapist, a pastor, a friend, a confidant. So face-to-face talking is important because through in-person talking, we can see the wound through words, through non-verbal expressions. And changes in intonation sometimes give us what's the weight of the pain. Silence and pauses can speak louder than words at times, and it is especially important when you're working with individuals whose first language is not English. Not all sexual abuses are equal. The effect of traumas vary in intensity, and research indicates that the level of distress experienced by survivors do not necessarily correspond with the severity of the abuse, as we can see in all three vignettes. It is important that when we work with survivors, we listen, understand, clarify, interpret in an integrative manner to stitch risks and resources, vulnerabilities and virtues, stressors and strengths in a meaningful whole, because we want to understand that after sexual abuse, who survived and thrived, what were the factors, and who did not. Let's not also underestimate the role of family dynamics, because sexual abuse is associated with dysfunctional family dynamics among other factors. We can teach our children how to take care of their bodies and souls, but perhaps we cannot inoculate every child from all adversities, including abuses. It is not responsibility of our children to learn ways to fend off potential abusers. We need to educate public, treat and rehabilitate sex offenders through effective, accessible, strength-based and culturally responsive programs so we can prevent sexual abuse in its trenches. Let me end my talk with the Rumi's quote that where the light is going to come into the wound to heal us. Do you think that the survivors of sexual abuse feel uplifted when they discuss their feelings of shame and guilt, or when they tell stories of their deficit and dysfunctions? I highly doubt. But think about survivors who will feel how they would feel if they would share the relief of untangling a problem they were grappling with for a while. Think about the joy a survivor would feel if they would tell us for not giving up and slugging through and finishing a difficult task. Imagine the satisfaction a survivor would tell us in managing complex social situations, or the delight a survivor will tell us they would experience by helping those who even did not ask for help. If our work with survivor is going to focus mostly on discussing shame and blame, folks, we will perpetuate the victim narrative. Ahmed, Lees and Antonio's may not explore the paths of healing and growth on their own. You have to be the conduit, you have to be the facilitator of their growth and potential flourishing. Without dismissing and minimizing shame, guilt, and the genuine insight which our survivors bring, the strengths can help them to reinterpret their self-concept and perhaps also increase self-efficacy. We need to do a lot more research to prove this. Let me end my talk. We all get wounded. Is there anyone in this audience who's listening to me who hasn't been hurt or wounded? We all get wounded one way or the other. Let the light of our own strengths touch and heal our wound. Thank you so much.
Everyone, this is Esther Dingemans, Director at the Mukwege Foundation. It's a pleasure to be part of this event today. Just quickly, the Mukwege Foundation works to prevent and to end sexual violence used as a weapon of war. And to start, I would like to just bring your attention to a report that was recently published by Save the Children. You may have seen it, called Sexual Violence Against Children in Conflict. This report provides striking figures of the numbers of children at risk of sexual violence in conflict. And it indicates that the risk today is almost at 10 times higher than it was 30 years ago. Now, during the last years, you can think about children being abducted and kept in slavery in Nigeria, in Syria, in Iraq, still children facing wartime sexual violence in DRC, Yemen, Central African Republic, and so on. And of course, this list by no means is meant to be exhaustive. Now, as you all know, sexual violence has devastating consequences for children. And when sexual violence is used as a weapon of war, these consequences are intended to be devastating for children, but also for their communities and societies at large. So it involves rape, rape using objects, using weapons, mass rape, sexual slavery, and so on. This, of course, this is a human crisis and it needs much stronger and coordinated response from the international community and from governments, but also from civil society. And I think that's in terms of prevention, but also in terms of care for the victims. The services are available for children who face sexual violence in conflict, are often really badly accessible, of poor standard, not coordinated. Now, today I would like to present the holistic care model or one-stop center used by Panzi Hospital that Dr. Mukwege founded nearly 20 years ago in Bukavu in Eastern DRC. We at the Mukwege Foundation, we try to promote and support the implementation of this model also in other conflict settings using a South-South approach, so linking experts and professionals from the Global South to promote learning and exchange. Now, this model is also used in other contexts around the world, but hardly ever in conflict settings. Now, how was the model developed? When war broke out in the region in Eastern DRC and women and girls arrived with really gruesome injuries, the Panzi team began to specialize in care for victims of sexual violence. Many of these victims are children and even very young children. Over a period of 10 years, for example, Panzi treated more than 200 children under the age of 5. And they had to really develop very specialized and advanced surgical care to be able to repair the damage done to these really tiny bodies. Now, they soon realized that without family support or education, psychological care for the child and her family, there's very little chances of success of surgery, not only for children, that is, but that's for all survivors. And that, for example, without fighting for justice at the same time, the violence will not end. Now, this led Panzi to develop this unique method combining 4 pillars of care, which are all provided at the hospital, or at least on the premises around it, and therefore called one-stop center. The approach rests on a few very important principles. The first one is survivor-centeredness. The healing pathway is really carved together with the victim and her caretaker if she's young. And the survivor is offered sort of a menu of services for which you can choose based on what her needs and preferences are, or his needs and preferences. Both boys are absolutely also among the victims. Every survivor is assigned a psychological assistant, and that person helps her navigate the available services and remains also the case manager throughout the process. So the system works in such a way to avoid that the victim has to repeat her story time after time again, because of course we all know that that can be very re-traumatizing. The Mukwege Foundation, together with other partners, including Panzi, is currently implementing this model in Central African Republic. And to ensure that the services really meet survivors' needs. Survivors there were really themselves involved in the design of the model from the very start. A second principle is integrated care, and this starts from the knowledge that survivors' needs are holistic and interlinked. In a one-stop center model or holistic care model, the staff of different disciplines are familiar with the services offered under each pillar of care, and they also receive training together, so they work as part of one team. I was once speaking to a doctor at Panzi, and he explained that he also saw himself as much more than a doctor, and that he looks at all the needs of survivors. And he explained that if a survivor has nothing to eat when she comes home, or if she's severely depressed, chances that his operation succeeded are in fact very slim. Similar, it's not hard to imagine that for a survivor to embark on a long and challenging way to justice, she does not only require legal aid, but also needs to feel fit and mentally and physically, and have sufficient means to actually pay, for example, the transport to court. Now, another key principle of Panzi's work is compassion. At Panzi, victims are really seen as heroes. They're really cherished, whereas in their communities often seen as outcast. Many victims of wartime rape, for example, do not feel welcome at places of worship. And at Panzi, they're the center, on the contrary, of all ceremonial activities. And this really helps in breaking the stigma. Survivors learn that they're not to blame and that they have dignity, and that the blame and the shame should be reversed to perpetrators. Now, when they go back to their community, they feel often much stronger and self-confident. But related to that return to the community, the final principle I would like to mention is how healing can also result in action for change. Many survivors at Panzi themselves actually become activists. They speak out against sexual violence in their community, together with civil society organizations. And a key component of the holistic care model is also the link with that advocacy work, but also doing community-based work, prevention, raising awareness in the community. And of course, then the fight for justice. Currently, survivors in DRC are advocating for the missing piece, what I would say is the missing piece in the puzzle of healing, and that's reparation. Survivors of sexual violence, including children born of war and child victims, have the right to reparations. That's a form of acknowledgement of the wrongdoing, It can include compensation for the harm done and, of course, guarantees of non-repetition. The Mukwege Foundation, together with Nadia's initiative, has launched a new initiative. It's called the Global Survivors Fund, and that's fully dedicated to this cause of enhancing reparation for victims of sexual violence in conflict at an international level and nationally. Now, with that, I would like to end, emphasizing again that the need to invest in holistic care for child victims of sexual violence in conflicts around the world should be a priority, as it gives really most chances of successful healing. Thank you all very much for listening.
Hi, my name is Dr. Janet Rosenzweig, and I consider it a privilege to have been invited to speak with you today at this very, very important conference. My topic today is going to be, what does sex education have to do with it? I believe that when we look at sex and love and faith, add medically accurate sex information, we go a long way toward promoting sexual health and safety, both in prevention and in healing. I'm an author. I've been working in the field of child sex abuse for close to 40 years. And my point of view that I feel very strongly about is promoting parents to be the primary sexuality educators of their kids. And I see that as an important protective factor in promoting sexual health and safety. I am delighted to bring a sex educator's perspective to this conference on faith and flourishing. And my respect and admiration goes out to all of the folks that organized it and my fellow participants. I'm coming to you with a very specific perspective. I have a strong developmental perspective on individuals and families. I was trained as a health and sex educator. I began working in the field of child sex abuse when I was recruited as a sex educator to work on a sex abuse helpline. And I've been a counselor, a therapist, a staff trainer, spent several decades as a public official working in child welfare, and I've been a prevention specialist, the former vice president of Prevent Child Abuse America, and I'm a mom. My ideal is really, really clear at this point. Every child should be able to go out into the world with age-appropriate, medically accurate information about human sexuality, all wrapped up in the values of their family and faith tradition. This, I believe, is the building blocks towards sexual health and safety. There's some important physical facts with emotional impact that as a sex educator, I think it's critical for everyone to know about who's working with child sexual abuse or victimization in any capacity. First and foremost, fact number one, the human body will react to various kinds of stimulation with very specific physical manifestations. And that is termed, by sexologists, by people working in the field, as the sexual response cycle. This is a very specific autonomic physical response that the body goes through, where they first experience arousal or excitement. They then experience a heightening of that arousal. They may experience orgasm or sexual release. And then there's a period of time that the body rests before the cycle can begin again. That is an autonomic response to very specific stimuli. And when I say it's autonomic, it's key to understand that the autonomic nervous system is the part of the nervous system responsible for controlling the bodily functions that are not consciously directed, like breathing, the heartbeat, digestive, etc. So an autonomic response is a response that the body has all by itself in response to physical stimuli. Now, why is that important for our work in child sexual abuse? Well, the key words here are the fact not consciously directed. Physical sexual arousal is an instinct, it's a reflex, and it's autonomic. There's some very important reasons why kids need to know this. Victims may experience a physical sexual response while being victimized. Happens to many kids. Predators may use the response against them, convincing the child they were a willing participant because they, quote unquote, enjoyed the act. That's a travesty. And this is a travesty that we can get rid of by being able to provide kids with accurate information. We don't want a child's natural physical response to be used against him. Another reason why kids need to know this is because the concept that sex abuse prevention is all about good touch, bad touch can be wildly confusing for a child who experiences physical arousal because a very careful, studied predator touched their bodies in ways to induce a response. And I've had adults who were victimized as children speak to me after conference and literally thank me for telling them that that was not their fault. And when am I going to get to the people who do the prevention work and tell us to stop teaching good touch, bad touch? Because when the touch feels good, the whole thing just becomes very, very confusing. That's another important lesson we need to take away from this concept. Another key reason why kids need to know this is because they confuse a physical sexual response with an emotional attachment. This makes them vulnerable to predators, particularly adolescents and teens. Physical sexual arousal, when the brain goes into that mode, particularly for a teen, that decreases sexual self-restraint. It may, in our context in this conference, may lead a victim to believe that they participated in a sinful act, unnecessarily adding guilt to their overwhelming sense of confusion. Parents need to know this because it is unhealthy to raise children who learn to associate negative emotions with their sexual arousal. When parents teach kids that fear, guilt, or shame is the feelings they need to associate with an autonomic bodily function, a normal function that indicates their body is working, when kids are raised to associate those negative feelings with that body response, at the very best, these negative emotions can interfere with a healthy adult sexual relationship. At worst, a child could grow into someone who needs these negative emotions to experience sexual arousal. That's not an outcome we want when we're looking to raise sexually safe and healthy kids. Another physical fact with emotional impact, fact number 2, having accurate, understandable language about all parts of the body, specifically the genitalia, is a protective factor in child sex abuse prevention. If a child becomes a victim, they'll have the language to tell a trusted adult. That's just key. A child who knows that it's okay to talk with their parents about sexuality will be able to ask questions, and they will not be tempted to turn to unsavory sources such as the internet or potentially predator older kids or adults in their quest for accurate information about sex. Faith-based and religious institutions can be a key source of sexuality information. They are consistently rated as a highly credible source when we look at national studies of where people get their sexuality information. There's spirituality imbued in all of our family values. We talk about holy matrimony, love your neighbor as thyself, love being patient and kind. The kind of lessons that we infuse in our spiritual teachings have wonderful information about for human sexuality and can set the groundwork and be part of sharing accurate information about human sexuality. And it's so key that the faith community step forward on this, because accurate information about child sexual abuse and human sexuality was really curtailed starting back in the 90s. There was a point where sex abuse prevention was replaced with Megan's laws and checking the registries, when people began to believe that if they checked the registries and determined there weren't any predators in their neighborhood, they had discharged their duty around sex abuse prevention. And that's just not true, because we know that the registries only catch the people that were caught and convicted, which is the tip of the iceberg of the predators that are out in the community. But the other chilling effect that we had in the 90s is that adults became concerned about being falsely accused by a child or parent if they spoke to a child about sexuality. I can remember in the 90s, my days in working with youth services, where it was completely accepted that when we were out on the basketball court, or that if a kid had a question about sexuality, it was our responsibility to give them an accurate answer. But by the 90s, people were not doing that. They were not going to speak about sexuality in anything other than a completely sanctioned place. Abstinence-only education funding in the 90s limited the topics that could be presented in a classroom. And then for folks who might remember Dr. Jocelyn Elders, the debacle in the 90s, when she was asked a question at an AIDS conference about if masturbation could be a useful tool to discourage kids from being sexually active, and she thought it might be a decent substitute, she was painted as a unsavory character, and her career as Surgeon General basically came to an end. So my point here is that we're finding very few adults feeling empowered or comfortable in talking to kids about sexuality. And, you know, even the most well-meaning adults were kind of chilled and stopped talking to kids, leaving kids vulnerable to getting inaccurate information, horrible values about sexuality from predators, pornography, or peer. This really leaves such an important opening for the faith community to step in. You know, regardless of the specific religious tradition, spirituality provides an absolutely perfect backdrop to talk about the values of love, empathy, honesty, and respect. And being responsible and responsive, partner with your local health educators, sex educators, or medical personnel in your congregation to help get these words out to kids and families, because it's going to help us as a prevention aspect by raising folks that are sexually healthy and safe, and help us on the healing aspect, particularly for victims who can feel empowered to speak up and understand that any reaction their body may have had was simply the reaction of a normal, healthy human body. Every major faith tradition recognizes a parent's right, if not responsibility, to teach their children about sexuality. And if you download these slides, and I hope you do, click through these links and you'll read some perspectives from the United Methodist Church, a Jewish perspective, an Islamic perspective. And this would be a wonderful time for you, who as somebody who is at this conference is interested in these issues, to find out what your faith tradition has to say. A faith tradition, as well as promoting the sharing of age-appropriate, medically accurate information, as well as supporting parents and people that care for kids to be in a role to impart accurate information, can be teaching important values. Compassion, for example. We find, for example, kids that have been the victim of online sexual exploitation, whose photographs, nude photographs, may have been shared far and wide without their permission. Oftentimes those kids find the shaming that came from their community is as painful, if not more so, than the actual betrayal that led to their picture being shown. The faith community can stand up when that happens, embrace the victim, and not blame the victim for having been victimized. The faith community can help parents learn to communicate about sexual health and safety, the physical, the emotional, and the spiritual aspects throughout. My core beliefs is that people are sexual from the time they are born. Sexuality permeates all aspects of their life. Parents can spend some time, and the faith community can help, articulating their own family values about sex and sexuality, but that parents need support in learning how to share this information with their kids. And a healthy environment allows positive feelings to become associated with sexual thoughts and feelings. Corinthians tells us if there's a natural body, there's also a spiritual body, and we can see the body as a temple, and the faith community can step up and address both as we support sexual health and safety in both prevention and recovery. My name is Dr. Janet Rosenzweig. You can learn more at sexwiseparent.com or email me at drrosenzweig@sexwiseparent.com. Thank you for listening to what I have to say, and thank you for participating in this conference.
Good morning. My name is Warren Kinghorn. I'm a psychiatrist on the faculty of Duke University School of Medicine. I'm also a Christian theologian who teaches at Duke Divinity School and co-directs the Duke Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative. It's my pleasure to speak with you today about the role of Christian communities in healing from child sexual trauma. I want to talk today about the way that churches, and indeed the resources of Scripture and Christian theology, can promote healing and post-traumatic growth. But it's important to first name that Christian communities are not always sites of healing. They may indeed be sites of trauma, sometimes sites where trauma is perpetuated, and all too often sites where the wounds of trauma are not healed. In the US, of course, we've seen this in the Catholic sexual abuse scandal, which is echoed in many other parts of the world. But we see on various scales in many other Christian denominations and communities also, from Christian networks such as the Southern Baptist Convention in the US, to individual congregations, to parachurch Christian ministries. Indeed, many churches and Christian communities may be structurally vulnerable to perpetuating childhood sexual trauma, for instance, by cloaking sex in shame, or by investing clergy and faith leaders with spiritual authority that makes others reluctant to report or to question abuse, or by blaming survivors for their trauma. This, of course, can cause intense psychological and physical harm to survivors, but it also causes spiritual harm. It can profoundly affect survivors' spiritual lives and relationship to God. Survivors may ask, where was God when this happened? Abuse may directly affect survivors' attachment to God. If the church is abusive, then perhaps God is abusive also. And it can cause lack of trust in the church, especially when the church was a site of trauma. It would seem to be this kind of behavior that Jesus so strongly condemned when he said in the Gospel of Matthew, "If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depth of the sea." So the hard news is that churches can be and are sites of trauma. But the good news is that churches can be and are also sites of healing, restoration, and growth. In this brief talk, I want to name 5 ways that Christian communities can be sites of healing from child sexual abuse. First, recognition. Second, lament. Third, justice. Fourth, acceptance and love. Fifth, agency and vocation. First, churches that want to be anti-abuse can begin with recognition. Recognition that around 1 in 10 children in the US, around 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 13 boys are sexually abused before their 18th birthday. 90% of child sexual abuse is perpetrated by someone the child or child's family knows. And that means that every community, every congregation, every classroom, and every conference, including this one, has a lot of people in it who are child sexual abuse survivors. And many communities also contain perpetrators. Although it's difficult to speak about this in communal settings where children are present, this must be kept in mind by any faith leader and can be carefully named in certain settings, such as adult education classes. And my experience is that when the experience of survivors is named, not in a way that directly re-exposes survivors to the details or context of trauma, but in a way that generally recognizes that survivors are part of every community, that itself is an important first step toward healing. But also recognition that Christian scripture and Christian faith are no stranger to child and adult sexual abuse. In her book, The Cry of Tamar, which I would recommend to anyone interested in the topic, Pamela Cooper White points out that in the sordid story recorded in 1 Samuel 13, King David's daughter Tamar was likely an adolescent when she was raped by her older brother Amnon. And not just sexually assaulted against her will, but then shamed and ostracized, her word disregarded, her story absorbed into a larger story of men guarding their property and honor. More speculatively, but in a way that has caught the attention of many of my students, Elaine Heath draws on St. Irenaeus of Lyon and Julian of Norwich to imagine that Adam and Eve in Genesis 2 and 3 were not mature adults, but rather immature children, childlike, who could not imagine what it meant to die, and who were deceived by a serpent whom they had not been told not to trust. The serpent, exploiting their innocence and vulnerability, acted as a groomer. And when they ate of the forbidden fruit, they experienced the deathly spiral of shame and separation, with shame prompting them to hide and to cover their most sensitive parts with painful nettle-like fig leaves, until God replaced these painful fig leaves with more comfortable skins. What if, Heath asks, Adam and Eve were not only agents of sin, but first victims, and if the very first sin were something akin to child sexual abuse? Heath argues further that Jesus himself, in the Passion that Christians just observed this past week, joined in solidarity with survivors of sexual abuse by being subject to sexual humiliation. Heath acknowledges that most Christians do not understand the Passion of Christ as sexual abuse, but she argues otherwise. Jesus was crucified naked, she says. Being stripped publicly prior to his crucifixion was a calculated act of sexual violence. In Jesus' culture, to be stripped naked in front of a watching crowd was an act of sexual violation, comparable to the dreadful images that emerged of Iraqi prisoners of war in the Abu Ghraib prison. Perhaps Jesus himself was no stranger to sexual violation. This profound recognition of sexual abuse in and by the church and awareness that God is close to survivors of sexual abuse gives rise to lament, the ability of survivors to carry their suffering to God with the expectation that God will hear, heal, and deliver. One lament psalm that can be very helpful, Psalm 142, with my voice I cry to the Lord. With my voice I make supplication to the Lord. I pour out my complaint before him. I tell my trouble before him. When my spirit is faint, you know my way. In the path where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me. Look on my right hand and see. There is no one who takes notice of me. No refuge remains to me. No one cares for me. I cry to you, O Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. Give heed to my cry, for I am brought very low. Save me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Bring me out of prison so that I may give thanks to your name. The righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me. This lament, though, cannot be the last word. It must be followed through with a commitment to justice in the church and beyond. A commitment to communities where all can live and grow in worship safely and free from harm. To communities working for the prevention of abuse. To communities willing to expose abuse and the perpetrators of abuse, whatever the cost, recognizing that there is no indispensable leader or institution when it comes to the exposing of abuse. There are by now many excellent organizations dedicated to preventing child sexual abuse in religious communities. I mentioned two here. One is Darkness to Light, whose website is displayed at the top here. Darkness to Light does a variety of different kinds of trainings around child sexual abuse prevention, and they embrace 5 principles for every congregation. First, learn the facts about abuse. Second, minimize opportunity to eliminate or reduce isolated one-on-one situations that decrease risk of abuse. 3, talk about it, to have open conversations with children about bodies, sex, and boundaries. 4th, recognize the signs, know the signs of abuse to protect children from further harm. And 5th, react responsibly, understand how to respond to warning signals, risky behaviors, and suspicions or reports of sexual abuse, including mandated reporting laws. Another such program is the Safe Sanctuaries program of the United Methodist Church. These programs are the beginning of the establishment of just communities in which churches are not sites of trauma, but rather places of healing and growth. And it's worth pointing out in this context that justice is centrally important, not just to the prevention of abuse, but also to healing from abuse. Healing from trauma requires vulnerability. It requires being safe enough to do the hard work of connecting to one's body, one's emotions, one's relationships. But you cannot expect trauma survivors to be vulnerable in a community that's not characterized by justice. Justice is a precondition for vulnerability, and therefore healing for trauma survivors who participate in faith communities. And this leads to the fourth point, that Christian communities at their best can offer acceptance and love to trauma survivors. This unconditional acceptance and love originates, of course, in God's acceptance and love. At the heart of Christian faith is the affirmation that the deepest truth of who we are is that we are loved and known by God before and surpassing all else. And this makes a difference for healing and recovery from trauma. It's worth remembering that none other than Marsha Linehan, the noted psychologist and founder of dialectical behavior therapy, one of the most respected and widely used therapies for trauma-related disorders, was very seriously emotionally disturbed as an adolescent and spent over 2 years in a psychiatric hospital. Then, as a young adult, she found herself praying in a Catholic chapel, perhaps this Catholic chapel at Cynical Retreat Center in Chicago, and she found herself deeply moved. One night, she said, I was kneeling in there, looking up at the cross, and the whole place became gold. Suddenly, I felt something coming toward me, she said. It was this shimmering experience, and I just ran back to my room and said, I love myself. It was the first time I remember talking to myself in the first person. I felt transformed. Linehan credits this with a radical acceptance that allowed her to heal, and importantly, to develop a treatment that would help many thousands of others to heal as well. Though DBT is not a specifically Christian treatment, Christian communities can and should provide pathways and gateways for trauma survivors to have access to high-quality mental health services. Which leads finally to the fifth dimension of how Christian communities can help survivors of Christian sexual abuse to heal. Healing is not only a matter of acceptance and love, not only a matter of finding the right clinical treatment, but also finding a call and vocation and a meaningful place in community. Judith Herman, the noted trauma psychologist, argues that an important experience of many, but not all trauma survivors, is the capacity to find what she calls a survivor mission, to engage in the wider world in the context of social action, giving to others, and pursuing justice. The survivor does so not because he or she will always be victorious in the specific pursuits, but rather, Herman says, on the knowledge that evil has not entirely prevailed and on the hope that restorative love may still be found in the world. I would suggest that churches are at their strongest when they take seriously this survivor mission. It is essential, but not enough, that churches and faith communities commit to preventing trauma in their midst and to avoid being sites of trauma. It is essential, but not enough, that churches and faith communities are sites of recognition, acceptance, and love for trauma survivors. It is essential, but not enough, that churches and faith communities promote high-quality mental health services. But at their best, churches and faith communities are also sites of vocation and call. The church offers Christians something to do, places to serve, people with whom to work and to act, not to deny or to avoid dealing with trauma, but rather to live lives that are not swallowed by trauma, in which trauma is not forgotten, but neither does it rule. Thank you.
My name is Janine Geske, and I'm going to be talking about doing healing work for survivors of childhood sexual assault through a variety of restorative justice processes. Let me tell you a little bit about myself first. I was both a trial court judge and a Wisconsin Supreme Court justice for quite some time. And as a judge, I sat on murder cases and sexual assault cases and other violent felonies, as well as other cases. And what I learned during that time as a judge was that the process of trying a case and ultimately sentencing an offender is not particularly satisfying to survivors. They really don't feel, no matter how much time you try to give them at sentencing, a chance to be able to relate the deep harm that's happened to them and the impact that it's had not only on their lives, but the lives of people close to you. So as I was leaving the Supreme Court, I became more and more involved in restorative justice. And I took a particular interest in dealing with clergy sex abuse in the Catholic Church and then in other faith traditions. so I began by having an international conference on the topic probably 15 years ago. And actually, then Bishop Cupich and Archbishop Martin from Dublin both came and spoke at the conference. So this is a long-term topic for me. I started doing work in Belgium and in Ireland, but then particularly in the United States, in trying to apply restorative justice processes to the crisis that's been created for survivors and families and for churches and community. We use victim offender dialogue models and circles that have been developed by both Native American tribes and First Nation tribes and Maori tribe in New Zealand. And we create a safe environment for people who have been deeply impacted to be able to tell their stories. And for people who have participated either directly or indirectly in some of the harm, to be able to listen and to also share their insights. There are 2 films that you can watch that are attached to the work that I do, particularly in this issue area. One is a film called The Healing Circle. It was one that I made all those years ago, of having a circle with survivors of sexual assault. We had now Cardinal Dolan, then he was Archbishop Dolan. We had a priest who had offended. We had people who left the church over it. We had a variety of people all tell their stories, and it gave you a sense of what that storytelling can be like. And there's another film about the restorative justice work that we've been working on in Minneapolis, St. Paul. I have 2 partners in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Father Dan Griffith and Julie Craven. And we have been involved first in a small way and then a much more substantial way in addressing that harm, not only directly with survivors, but working with the harm in the parishes, working with the harm that the Archdiocese has caused, doing preventive work by doing circles in seminaries and with priests and with other people. And you can see some of that in the film. In looking at these processes, the primary focus has always got to be the harm. We're not focusing on the perpetrator or the offender, but the harm, and in particular, the survivor herself or himself, and the harm that's been done to them. But we also look at what I call the ripples, people around that man and that woman, and family members and trusted members and members of the faith community and all sorts of people that also are impacted by that harm. And what we do in lots of processes is try to use a circle process, is try to bring people together who can have almost a mini truth and reconciliation process. That is, at least the truth part, where survivors and those who have been impacted can tell their stories. We, as a facilitator, create a safe environment to have that happen. And part of creating a safe environment there are lots of details to it, but one of the most important parts of it is the more intense the circle is going to be, the more preparation that those of us who facilitate those circles need to do. We need to prepare people so they come in with humility and respect and openness, so that we can have a place that's safe for the survivors, but safe for everybody to be able to tell their stories, and to listen with their hearts, and to be able, hopefully, to have that turning of the heart into one of whether it's recognition of the harm, whether it's a cognition of what our role has been, whether it's the deep harm that's been caused. I've done a number of these circles, and, people will say things like, well, I wasn't directly impacted. I didn't have a child assaulted. I didn't have somebody assaulted. It didn't really impact me other than I lost my faith. And you hear those words and you think, oh my God, what they lost is so immense, and they are not a direct victim of the sexual assault. When you talk to survivors of sexual violence, they will tell you the deep, deep impact in all aspects of their life that assault had them. In the courtroom, we talk about physically what's happened. Where were you touched? How long were you touched? What was he doing? But if you talk to survivors, that's not the harm they describe, not the physical touching. It is the stealing of, sometimes they describe it stealing of their soul. It's the complete devastation of their sense of trust, particularly if somebody is in a position of trust, whether it's a religious community or someone else, and that has life-changing impact. And I mean life-changing, not for a couple of years, but for many of them, a lifetime of change because of what happened in those situations. So in doing this work, we work alongside, obviously, with therapists and psychologists and people that do systems changes and all sorts of professionals that have hard work to do. But the restorative justice is a place where survivors and their supporters, their friends, their neighbors, their family can relate what's happened to them and have people who have been involved in some way, whether it's administrative involvement, supervisory involvement, or whether it's the offender himself or herself, have to listen to the impact. I've done these cases for years in cases of homicide, where family members of homicide victims participate, and other violent crimes, incest and sexual assault. And if it's done right, there is a transformational moment in these processes. And it's not for me to predict what the transformation is, but I can tell you that survivors are always grateful that they've gone through it. And so are the people who have been accused of having a role in it. And it does change people. It clears the air and helps people to move on. The last piece I want to mention is the whole issue of healing and forgiving. We talk a lot about forgiving and restorative justice, but one of my survivors taught me very early that forgiving, first of all, is about the person who's been harmed. It's not about the person who committed the offense. And that forgiving and healing are ing words. That what she means by that is that they are journeys. There isn't an event where you say, well, I'm healed of that and I can move on. That doesn't exist when you're dealing with sexual assault. So we are working on a path and trying to make the path open up for a survivor and his or her friends, neighbors, family to be able to move forward on that path of healing. Whether they want to express the word forgiving or not is totally up to them. For some people, that's a bad word. They call it the F word. And they say, don't ask me to forgive. On the other hand, other people express it. Some people just demonstrate it by what my friend Mark Umbright calls is the spirit of forgiving, that you can see it even though no one says the word. So I encourage you all to watch the films and understand that these processes can play a part in the big journey of healing for survivors of childhood sexual assault.